Tonight, there is nowhere you need to be except here, where the day has already begun to fade behind the mountains, and the world is slowly exchanging light for silence. Allow your breathing to settle into an easy rhythm, and let every thought that has followed you through the day become a little quieter with each passing moment, as though it were drifting away on the evening air. Our journey takes us more than 2,000 years ago to the sacred terraces of Sarmizegetusa, the mountain sanctuary of the Dacian kingdom. Long before its stones became silent ruins, this was a place where priests watched the heavens with extraordinary patience, where the passing of seasons was measured against the stars, and where every evening returned with the reassuring certainty of a familiar ritual. For one old observer climbing the mountain as he had done countless times before, believing he was about to witness another ordinary night beneath the familiar constellations, unaware that the smallest of observations can sometimes become the beginning of a story that lingers long after the stars themselves have disappeared from the sky. So, settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let the mountain receive you as gently as it received every watcher who came before. The evening meal ended before the light had left the valley. The old man folded a piece of bread into a linen cloth, placed it inside his satchel beside the clay cup, and stepped outside. The forge was still open. The blacksmith stood in the doorway with his leather apron tied around his waist. A bar of iron rested on the anvil. It would still be there in the morning. "You'll miss the light," he said. The old man looked toward the ridge above the trees. "I won't." The blacksmith smiled, although it was difficult to tell whether the smile belonged to the answer or to something he had decided not to say. They parted without another word. The path began behind the last house. It climbed steadily through the beech woods, crossed the spring halfway up the slope, then continued toward the upper terraces where the sanctuary stood above the forest. He had walked it often enough to know where loose stones gathered after a heavy rain, where water lingered longest in the ruts, and where the first evening breeze always found him. At the spring, he filled the cup. The water was cold. He drank, wiped the rim with his thumb, and listened to the stream for a while. Someone had tied a fresh strip of woven wool around a young hazel branch beside the water. He had never noticed it before. He touched the strip of wool with the back of his fingers. It was dry. The color had not yet faded. Someone had tied it there that day. He let it be. The path climbed away from the spring in a series of broad turns. Here the beeches grew farther apart, allowing the last sunlight to reach the ground for a little longer before evening settled over the hillside. A lizard darted between two warm stones and disappeared into a crack too narrow for anything larger to follow. The old man smiled. His teacher used to say that lizards always knew where the warmth would remain after sunset. He had never tested the idea. There had never been a reason to. The forest ended almost without warning. A few more steps, and the ground opened into the first terrace. The familiar walls stood where they always had, holding the hillside in place with courses of pale limestone, fitted so closely that even the smallest plants struggled to find room between them. Grass had begun to reclaim the edges of the path. Someone would cut it before the next ceremony. He rested his hand on the nearest stone while catching his breath. The limestone still held the day's warmth. That surprised him. The air had cooled more quickly than usual. He looked toward the western ridge. The sun had already slipped behind it. For a moment he stood without moving, his palm still against the stone. Then he climbed the last stretch to the sanctuary. The first terrace was empty. He crossed it without slowing. A rake leaned against the retaining wall where someone had left it after clearing the grass. Fresh cuttings lay in small piles along the edge of the path, carrying the sharp scent of crushed stems into the evening air. The sanctuary stood a little farther uphill. As always, he left the satchel outside the circle of stones. He unfolded the linen cloth and took out the small wooden rod wrapped inside. Years of use had polished the wood until it felt almost like river stone. Near one end, a row of shallow marks caught the last of the daylight. A few dry leaves had gathered between the stones. He brushed them aside with his foot. The work took only a moment. A breeze crossed the terrace, bringing the warmth of sunlit limestone and the faint smell of wood smoke from the settlement below. Somewhere in the distance, an axe struck timber. Then came the second blow. He waited for the third. It never came. His eyes lifted to the western horizon. He placed the wooden rod across two of the stones and adjusted it by the width of a finger. Then he stepped back. The position looked right. He folded the linen cloth and returned it to the satchel before sitting on the low patch of grass beside the circle. From there, the western ridge filled the lower edge of the sky, leaving the rest open above him. A swallow crossed the sanctuary, then another one, lower than the first. They circled once and disappeared beyond the trees. Evening arrived slowly on the mountain. The warmth left the stones before it left the air. Shadows stretched across the terraces, reaching the circle one by one until only the highest edges still caught the light. He rested both hands on his knees. Nothing asked for his attention yet. That was the part of the work most people never understood. Watching began long before there was anything to see. The western ridge held the sun for a few moments longer. He watched the light withdraw from the highest branches before it settled on the stones around him. The warmth beneath his hand faded slowly. It always disappeared from the limestone before the first star appeared. He knew where to look. His gaze rested on a narrow stretch of sky above the ridge. To anyone else, it would have seemed no different from the rest of the horizon. He had been watching the same place for longer than many of the men in the settlement had been alive. A nightjar called from somewhere beyond the terraces. He listened without turning his head. The first star held its place above the western ridge, while the last of the daylight faded from the valley. He waited a little longer before reaching for the cord. The knots had been tied years apart. Some were darker than the others where his fingers had worn the fibers smooth. He ran his thumb along them until he found the next empty space, tightened a new knot, and laid the cord beside the wooden rod once again. A cool breath of air drifted across the terrace. It carried the smell of beech leaves from the forest below, mixed with the warmth still rising from the limestone beneath his hand. The change came every evening. By morning, the stones would feel cold again. His eyes returned to the horizon. The first star was climbing now as two other had appeared above it. He watched without moving. The patch of flattened grass stayed at the edge of his vision, while the sky continued its slow turning above the ridge. There would be time to look at it later. The stars would not wait. The wooden rod rested where he had placed it. He lifted it once more and lined its edge with the highest point of the western ridge, holding it there until another familiar light separated itself from the darkening sky. The movement had become so precise that his hands no longer seemed to ask permission from thought. A gust of wind crossed the sanctuary, bending the grass for only a moment before disappearing into the trees below. The smell of smoke had faded. In its place came the damp scent of the forest, climbing the hillside with the evening air. A moth settled on the linen cloth beside the satchel. Its wings opened and closed once before it disappeared into the darkness. He lowered the rod. The western sky had given him everything it would give that evening. His attention shifted east, where the darker hours always began. Time passed differently here. Down in the settlement, evening was measured by cooking fires, by the sound of gates closing, by neighbors calling to one another before darkness settled over the valley. On the terrace, the sky kept its own measure. A small owl landed on one of the outer stones. It remained there only for a few heartbeats before lifting into the dark. His gaze followed its flight for a moment. When he looked back, something near the eastern edge of the circle caught his attention. The grass had been pressed flat. Only a narrow patch, no larger than a folded cloak. He could not remember seeing it there the evening before. The ridge had become a dark line against the sky. As the darkness deepened, familiar stars returned, one after another, each appearing where he expected it. Every so often he lifted the rod, checked its position against the horizon, and set it down again. When the next observation was complete, he tied a fresh knot in the cord, rolled it carefully between his fingers, and placed it back inside the satchel. He waited for the next familiar light to clear the ridge. When it appeared, he reached for the wooden rod without hesitation. The mark did not meet the star. He checked the line again, turning the rod in his hands before setting it back across the stones. The result did not change. His thumb rested on the narrow crack running through the wood. The old man looked back at the sky. The star remained exactly where it had been, he left the rod where it was. The next star would settle the matter. He waited, keeping his eyes on the eastern sky while the darkness deepened around the sanctuary. The familiar pattern continued to unfold above the hills, patient enough that each new light seemed to arrive alone. When the next star appeared, he raised the rod again. Its place agreed with the mark. He checked it a second time before lowering the rod. The line remained true. His gaze drifted back toward the western ridge. The first star had not changed. For a long while he remained motionless, moving only his eyes from one part of the sky to another. The cord stayed inside the satchel. He reached for neither the rod nor the stones. Something had escaped him, whether it belonged to the sky or to his own memory, he could not yet tell. He rose slowly and walked once around the circle. The stones had cooled beneath the night air. His hand rested on each of them for no longer than a breath before moving to the next. It was another habit whose beginning he no longer remembered. Near the eastern side of the sanctuary, he stopped. The flattened patch of grass lay where he had noticed it earlier. In the darkness, it seemed smaller. He crouched and parted the blades with his fingertips. The soil beneath was firm. No fresh cut. No broken stem. Only grass pressed close to the earth, as though someone had remained there for a while without speaking or moving. He straightened and looked across the sanctuary. Nothing answered his gaze. The terraces beyond the circle lay empty beneath the stars. He listened. The mountain offered only the quiet sounds it always had. After a moment, he returned to the wooden rod. The sky had been waiting for him longer than he had been looking at the grass. Nothing on the terrace seemed different from a few moments before. The first star had climbed higher now. Its place among the others no longer troubled him as much as it had. A faint sound reached him from somewhere beyond the circle, stone against stone, so slight that he might have mistaken it for the hillside, settling after the warmth of the day. He waited. The sound did not come again. His eyes remained on the sky for another moment before he lowered them toward the sanctuary. One of the smaller stones near the outer edge of the circle no longer stood exactly where he remembered it. It had not fallen. It had shifted, no more than the width of a hand. He looked at it for a long while without moving. Then he reached for the wooden rod, laid it beside the stone, and measured the distance in silence. He measured it a second time. The rod reached the same place. He turned it over and measured again, using the opposite edge. The distance remained unchanged. Every stone held its place. Every gap between them looked familiar. The larger blocks had not moved in his lifetime. No one expected them to. He returned to the smaller stone. The earth around its base had crumbled slightly. He crouched and gathered a pinch of loose soil between his fingers. It was dry. Someone had lifted the stone. Not long ago. Whatever had brought it out of place had already come and gone. He rested the wooden rod against the larger block beside him and looked once more across the circle. The sanctuary offered nothing else. Every shadow lay where it had before. Beyond the stones, the terraces had dissolved into darkness. He waited. Nothing changed. At last he returned to his place beside the rod. The stars had climbed higher. The night settled over the terraces. One by one, the familiar landmarks disappeared until only the pale circles of limestone remained visible beneath the stars. Beyond them, the mountain became a single dark shape against the sky. He watched in silence. His gaze drifted across the sanctuary. For a moment, he thought he saw something standing beyond the outer circle. He looked again. The shape was gone. He fastened the strap of the satchel and remained where he was. The smaller stone stood exactly as he had left it. His eyes moved slowly across the circle one last time before beginning the walk back. They stopped at the edge of the flattened grass. A second patch had appeared. It lay a few paces farther away, closer to the trees. He was certain it had not been there earlier. For a long while he simply looked at it. The distance between the two patches would have taken no more than 3 or 4 quiet steps. He crossed neither of them. Instead, he lifted his eyes toward the dark line of the forest. Nothing moved. The mountain held its silence. He turned back to the sanctuary. The stars remained exactly where they should. For several moments, he did nothing. The mountain before dawn belonged to no one. He had always liked that hour best. It asked nothing of those who kept watch. He rose, brushing the dry grass from his cloak. The flattened patches remained near the edge of the sanctuary. He counted them once more. 2. His eyes lingered on the darker space beyond them. A narrow path led into the forest, though few people used it after sunset. He had almost turned away when a faint glimmer caught between the trunks. It appeared only for an instant, like starlight striking polished metal. When he looked again, the forest had swallowed it. He walked as far as the outer stones and stopped. Beyond them, the ground sloped gently toward the trees, where darkness gathered beneath the branches, long before it reached the open terraces. The narrow path disappeared after only a few steps, swallowed by beech and hazel. He waited. Nothing moved. The grass beside the path bent in several places, never enough to form a trail, yet too regular to belong to chance. Here and there the dew had already been brushed away, leaving darker blades among the silver ones. He followed the marks with his eyes until they vanished between the trees. The mountain kept the rest for itself. Dawn was still some time away. The stars had not finished speaking. He remained beside the circle until the eastern horizon began to pale, watching the stars surrender one by one to the coming light, while the limestone slowly recovered its color and the outlines of the terraces emerged from the darkness, as though they had been waiting patiently beneath it all along. He found himself looking once more toward the edge of the clearing, where the flattened grass rested beneath a thin veil of morning dew. The silver beads covered every blade around it, while the pressed patches remained strangely untouched, preserving the warmth of a body that had lingered there long enough to keep the night from settling completely. He walked no closer. Whatever had happened belonged to the hours now slipping away, and daylight had already begun its patient work of erasing them. The bent grass was rising almost imperceptibly, returning to the shape it had held the evening before, while the first rays of the sun reached the highest branches above the sanctuary and turned the leaves into shifting fragments of pale gold. For a long moment he stood without moving, allowing his eyes to travel from the forest to the circle of stones and back again, as though committing both to memory with a care he had never considered necessary before. Nothing around him asked to be remembered. Nothing announced an ending. The mountain received the morning exactly as it had received countless mornings before. Yet, as he tightened the strap of the satchel and turned toward the descending path, an unfamiliar hesitation held him for the space of a single breath. It was light enough now to see the trail clearly, light enough to leave the sanctuary behind. And still he looked back once more, because a feeling quiet enough to escape any name he could have given it had settled beside him before dawn and had chosen to remain. He had almost reached the spring when footsteps rose from the path below. A young man appeared between the beeches, breathing a little faster from the climb. He bowed his head before stopping a few paces away. "I thought I might find you here." The old man smiled. "The council has gathered," the young man said. "They've been waiting for you." The old man nodded and reached for the clay cup. For a while, neither of them spoke. "They say the Romans are closer again." The old man let the water run over his hands before filling the cup. "So they say." The young man watched the current for a moment. "People are talking. They always do." He drank quietly, wiped the rim of the cup with his thumb, and placed it back inside the satchel. The day was only beginning. As they walked down the mountain, the old man looked back only once. The sanctuary had already disappeared behind the trees. Soon the path itself would vanish, then the spring, then the terraces, until nothing remained except the memory of where each of them had stood. He wondered, not for the first time, whether places were forgotten in the same way that stars disappeared at dawn, never truly gone, only hidden by a brighter light, until the darkness returned and someone patient enough remembered where to look. The sound of their footsteps grew softer beneath the trees. Above the mountain, the stars waited beyond the light, hidden for a little while, keeping their places with the same patient silence that had guided every watcher before him, and every watcher yet to come.